No Heroes Here, A Father's Journal. Written by Joseph Doty. Compiled and edited by Scott and Mary Ann Doty. Part 2.
Chapter 9. Loaded on familiar trucks, we took off suddenly to what seemed a nearby battlefront. We traveled in fits and starts as the road wound around many small hamlets. Some were of a pretty good size and could be called towns if they could have afforded paving stones. But they could not, and it was just dust, dust, dust. We ate sea rations while on the truck, and the only time we stopped was when a shell crater in the road delayed us. I thought we were just around the corner from the shooting when the trucks pulled off the road and into a field full of vehicles and tents. The night was falling, and it was pitch black by the time we were offloaded and counted. Lined up, leaving our gear on the trucks, we shuffled off, not knowing what to expect next. We came to a station of officers and were told to empty our pockets and wallets of all identification. All this was dumped into a garbage can to burn the following day. From there we were led into a tent and surrounded by dentists. With little flashlights and big instruments, they peered into and probed our mouths, looking for a tooth that might cause a problem when we were in battle. I felt sorry for anyone with a bad tooth that night because he did not have it for long. This was happening near a battle line close enough to have the area lit up by big shells exploding. Machine gun fire could be detected if one's senses were sharp. We all had acute senses that night. We lay on the ground. We sure did not sleep much. We were up and ready to go at daybreak, but the road we would use was still under enemy fire. We were told to load up about mid-afternoon and started again towards the battlefront. As we boarded the trucks, I glanced at my watch. It read 3 o'clock. Too bad, I thought, we would probably miss supper. I was so right. As soon as we returned to the road, we had to stop for a shell hole we filled in. We were more than ever aware of how close we were to the real thing. This hole was still smoking. American planes zoomed close overhead. One, disabled, had crashed in the field alongside the road and was burning furiously. Unnoticed at first, a low-hanging cloud of dense black smoke had blotted out the sun. Night again was too suddenly upon us. The banging of artillery seemed to be coming from both sides of the road. Now it was so littered we were barely moving. Our drivers were getting jumpier by the wheel turn. If it had not been for the military police stationed along the way, they would have turned around and gone back to have their teeth checked, and their passengers would have been delighted to have gone with them. A little farther along the way, we entered the outer fringe of a burning wooded area. Not aflame as it would be in a forest fire, although trees were burning. Most of the flame and smoke were from the burning equipment and carcasses of horses the Germans used to pull their artillery pieces. Even to an untrained eye, it was apparent that this area had been shelled by both sides and our strafing planes. Not a single gun carriage or truck had not been torn apart. The smoke was so thick and obnoxious that several of the men became nauseous. It lay close to the ground as if unwilling to leave its source. Large chunks of burning horseflesh lay scattered around, lending its peculiar odor to the scene. Our truck rolled over the dismembered leg of one of the poor animals, causing the vehicle to lurch sharply. One of us caught off balance, lost his footing, and fell heavily to the ground. I saw him roll to the side of the road and lay there. He was either too severely hurt to get up or quickly planned how to get out of the war early. When we came to the end of the line, we quickly jumped off the trucks. Following our officers, we ran to the cover of the trees lining the road. I began feeling sick as I stood there momentarily, taking in this bizarre scene. Perhaps it was the disgusting smoke, but my knees were wobbling at the same time, and I could barely resist the fear impulse to wet myself. I did not have this sensation while on the truck. Perhaps that was a buffer between what I felt now as a participant and what was previously a feeling of spectator. Stealing a look around at the others, I sensed they felt the same as I. The noise around us was deafening. If it were not, I guess our knees would have been heard playing a tune. After taking a breath or two, we hustled along a deeper path into the woods. I caught a glimpse of German prisoners standing with hands behind their heads. Wounded men from both sides were being attended to by our medics. We came to the end of the path and found ourselves on the edge of a field, occupied by an artillery group setting up their guns, ordered to help with the digging in. I thought I was assigned to this group. I was just one of several who had volunteered to help while my future disposition was arranged. Strangely enough, although 20 of us had gotten off the truck, only 5 were at work digging. We wondered where the others were. I am sure they also wondered the same about us. As soon as one of the guns was set up, we began to fire. Finally, after a lot of hard work, they were all banging away at the unseen enemy. As the last one went into action, we could rest the remainder of the night, but there was little rest. We settled down in a depression in the ground, although full of little rocks. It would at least protect us if fired upon, if I had the comfort of a sleeping bag, or if the guns did not continue to fire through the night, and if I was not so scared, I might have slept. As it was, I lay there talking to the other guys until night lost its battle with bad grace. With the dawn, a corporal appeared out of the smoke and morning mist. Amazingly, he had our names down on a scrap of paper. I had begun to feel that nobody knew who I was or where I was. Just because he called my name made me feel friendly towards him. He told us to get our stuff together and be ready to move out after we had something to eat. Luckily, we were invited by one of the artillery gangs to eat with them. I had a good chance to observe this corporal who appeared from the front lines in the morning mist and called my name. He was from Oregon, talked like a cowboy, and had a thin, hollowed-out face with a long chin and a nose so sharp and thin that I wondered if he had trouble breathing through it. While eating, I learned I was assigned to the 91st Infantry Division. I was pleased to find out all the artillery pieces I had helped dig in belonged to the 91st. Not only because of the work I had done, but they were damned efficient, and I wanted that kind of organization on my side. We left as soon as we had eaten. Some of the night was still in the sky, and the mist rising from the ground and mixed with the remaining smoke of the previous day's fighting. It gave the whole area the feeling of an old spooky movie I had seen in the old Warburton Theater back home. I was glad to get out of there, and a little later, when the sun rose, I found myself whistling a little. The corporal soon put a stop to that. It took the entire morning and part of the afternoon to reach our destination, not because the distance was so great, but because we had to go cross-country, clambering up and down the steep sides of ravines, cautiously avoiding all bridges, whether blown or not. The corporal had us wait many times as he crept ahead to be sure the area was safe. On the way to get us, he was fired at twice. Following the same trail back, he was extra careful because of his charges. While taking a short C-ration break, the corporal told us we would soon cross a large open area. We would be under the eyes and muzzles of German artillery, and should expect to be under fire from bush to wall, from wall to tree. When the shells did come at us, we lay flat on the ground if caught in the open. As soon as a shell exploded, we would jump up and run to the next piece of cover. Part of the way was covered by crawling along a dry irrigation ditch, which provided proper protection for us except for a direct hit. We came to a part of the ditch that had been hit by a German shell. Alongside the ditch was the body of an American soldier covered by a piece of canvas. The only visible part of the poor guy was his shoes, reasonably clean and hardly broken in. They identified him as a rookie. I wondered if I had known him. Realizing the Germans had the ditch zeroed in, the corporal had us leave it. We ran full out of a small group of trees, throwing ourselves to the ground at the sound of an incoming shell. At one time in our trip, I observed another group scatter at the sound of an incoming shell. I sucked in my breath and quietly cursed as 2 of the group were hit and fell to the ground. Some of those shells came awfully close to us, close enough to feel the heat of the explosion and hear the fragments strike the ground or slam into trees. A lovely way to spend a day in sunny Italy. Chapter 10. We reached our unit late in the afternoon, and very briefly introduced to the men with whom I would spend the next 4 or 5 weeks in combat. Actually, they were only pointed out to me as they were well concealed in their slit trenches. There was no doubt as to how close we were to the enemy. Not more than 10 minutes after I arrived, 3 German soldiers came running down the road, not more than 50 feet from where I was digging a slit trench. They had their hand raised in surrender, and they were told to lie down on the road and then search for hidden weapons. After this, they were sent under guard back to our headquarters. The enemy might have seen our actions because in retaliation they began to shell us very heavily. Phosphorus marking shells straddled us, and the incoming mail grew thicker by the clock tick. When the word came to move out, I went as fast as anybody. Thankfully, I did not just bolt, although I could have if pushed in that direction. Instead, I waited for the gun to be disassembled and the group to form. Then I took off with them. I remember running down a path with 2 20-pound ammo boxes, my pack, my rifle, and a full cartridge belt. I had not gone just a few steps when the cartridge belt slid down from my waist. If I had not been so scared, I might have laughed at myself. As it was, tears of fear and frustration stung my eyes as we beat a hasty retreat from our position. It had been a hard day and night, followed by another day to get where I was. What with the truck convoy, helping to dig in the artillery pieces, the constant firing of the big guns all night, no sleep the whole day running and crawling, ducking artillery shells being shot at me. The cumulative effect of it all hit me now, all at once as I ran for my life. Ashamed as I am to admit it, I must, for on that day I passed out from exhaustion. The hardness of the ground as my face dug into it felt more like a feather cushion. The shells as they slammed into the trees and ground around us were a discordant lullaby, and I longed to lie there and cry into the dust of Italy. If it were not for the charitable acts of my comrades, I would have lain there and become a prisoner or a casualty, which one I did not care about. As it was, they picked me up and carried me along with them. Although that was the only time I let the guys down, the shame I felt stays with me today. To those men and boys, for truthfully, half were little or no older than I, but hardened by a month or a day of war, my collapse was understood but not condoned. This would be overlooked if I could do my assigned duty tomorrow and in the coming days. I was left alone that night with some cold rations, laying on the ground thinking for a while, and then, of course, I slept. Damn, that was a bad day. As I was helped the next day, I heard what would become a familiar and comforting sound of our artillery. It seemed they were laying a carpet of iron over our heads as they sought to assist us in getting out of a tight spot. I wondered later if some of the guns I had helped dig in had been that covering barrage. At that time, the American Fifth Army and its allies were in a battle with the enemy fighting from a defensive line across Italy. The pivot point of the line was a lake area called Trasimene, and of course the front was called the Trasimene line. This line's function was to delay the rapid advance of the Allies, who had continued to press forward after the capture of Rome on June 4th. This rapid advance continued until June 20th, when the Allies ran up against this defensive line, hastily formed but effective. The Germans re-established themselves across the width of Italy with this line. They were determined to cost the Allies troops, material, and more significantly, time, as a second line was being formed north of Pisa, intended to stop our advance. Until the heavy fighting in late July at the Arno River, each day was a repeat of the one before. The Germans would stand and fight just long enough and with enough force to cause the Allies to launch an attack. As soon as one was launched, the Germans would fall back steadily against the outer fringes of the so-called Gothic line. Except for a significant breakthrough on June 30th at the Cesena River, the front remained in this condition until July 15th. At that time, the Germans stiffened their defenses with fresh troops, and our advances became slower and more expensive. Our experiences with this holding tactic were similar in every way. When our advance rifle company contacted the rearguard elements of the Germans, a protracted shooting battle would result. The enemy tried to wear down our divisional strength. Still, they also did their hardest to use the precious Italian summer weather. By July 17th, the 91st had captured Pontedera and moved towards the Arno River. This action was the last one in which I was an active participant. After escaping the German artillery attack, the company was assigned a holding position for the rest of the day and night. The next morning, the company's veterans received the good news that we were being pulled back from the line for a brief but deserved rest. After 24 hours in an infantry company, I was glad to hear the news. Chapter 11. Upon returning to the battle line, we spent 3 or 4 days running, falling, and doing other things necessary to stay alive when someone was shooting both small and large projectiles at us. Some men had been fighting for up to 3 or 4 weeks and were grubby, whiskered, and smelly. After my short stay, sleeping in or on the ground, always tense, eating cold rations when the opportunity presented itself, I thought I must also look the veteran. As I skulked past a wounded GI, sitting with his back to what remained of a farmhouse wall, he said, "Up for the first time?" "Yeah," I replied. "How could you tell?" "That's easy. You are still ducking at every shell you hear, even ours." We had a second lieutenant in our company who had an affection for Air Force clothing. He wore an Air Force pilot cap and a fleece-lined leather jacket, and carried an Air Force weapon called a grease gun. It was a .45 caliber automatic weapon that was remarkably similar in appearance to the piece of equipment your local mechanic used when he lubricated your car. He also wore a pencil-thin mustache entirely out of context to his mouth, which was a small, pale, tight line about an inch long. On an afternoon, I remember, we started off for somewhere and quickly came under light sniper fire, followed almost at once by machine gun fire. No cover being available, we sought concealment in a convenient cornfield. Our foolish-looking lieutenant, as described above, was apparently going to act foolish as well. Disregarding all words of advice, he ran back and forth along the edge of the cornfield, yelling instructions at everybody. The Germans would have had to be blind not to see him, and if they did not know where we were before, they certainly did now. An exploratory round came whistling in, then another, and the lieutenant was on the ground bleeding from the head. A couple of others had been hit, and the CO got us on our feet and out of there. A few more rounds were fired at us, but no one else was hurt as we ran across the field and out of range of the gun that was shooting at us. How was a company of infantry expected to cross an open field in broad daylight without being detected? We finally found cover, the wounded were taken care of, and we waited for further orders. As we waited, we got to talking about what to expect from the Germans if we were captured. Some of the men, who seemed more experienced, told the replacements it was not a good idea to be caught carrying a bayonet. Worse yet, do not get caught with any knife in your possession. The Germans have hated knife work ever since the Allies had used certain North African troops, expert with knives, to crawl around at night looking for German throats to cut. I did not throw my bayonet or knife away. Nobody else did either. But if one of us had, I'll bet the others would have followed suit. Rumors like that were always going around. One time it was to get rid of our gas masks. The Germans might think we were getting ready to gas them, and we would be tortured if captured. Another foolish suggestion was not to fire your gun. If you were captured and your rifle barrel was clean, they would go easy on you. That one I could not follow at all. All these rumors could only be aimed at making us less effective soldiers, and were probably started by the Germans anyway. Formed back into our proper squads, we had to run across another open area and into a shallow ditch that ended in a trench. It was an actual full-size trench, not a shallow zigzag one, one deep enough for me to run along under cover if I kept my head down, which nobody had to tell me to do. As I rounded a corner, I came upon 2 German soldiers, badly wounded, if not dead. They were lying there, all sprawled out as if they had taken a nasty spill on a skiing hill. A little further along were some American soldiers who had been wounded. Although shooting was going on most of the day, it could never be said it was heavy. But the accuracy of those doing the shooting was proven many times over. The trench ended near a macadam road across which we ran without our officers' prompting. There were some houses nearby, and we made for them on the double. Turning the corner of the first house, we saw a dramatic scene. An Italian man was holding a German soldier at rifle point. The German, hands tied behind his back, was lying face down in the dirt. It was a hot day, and he was sweating profusely, as was the Italian. Whatever the German's fate was, I never found out, as several rounds of German shells arrived on the scene, and we left running through what must have been the backyards of this village. Whenever we rested, we talked about the trench we had run through that afternoon. No one seemed to agree about how deep, wide, or long it was, but I remember it being about 5 feet deep, 3 or 4 wide, and overall about the same length as a football field. We all agreed that we felt that time had returned to World War I when we were in the trench. But, considering the rail transportation many of us had experienced in North Africa, why be surprised? The company had several skirmishes with the Germans in the late afternoon, but they were not serious. In fact, we were never told to set up our guns. The action finally settled to no action, and we began digging in for the night. Suddenly, a half-dozen or so German artillery rounds landed a short distance from us, followed by the roar of tank engines. We unexpectedly had the company of a segment of the 1st Armored Division. They had been the target of the shooting, and not wanting to draw any more attention, they left their position and came to keep us company. Arriving so unexpectedly along with a giant cloud of dust, we all scattered in every direction. Skidding to a stop, the 1st Armored Division crew members threw open the hatches and started to kid the heck out of us for being nervous. I will leave out the conversation that ensued to your imagination. Outside of the general confusion they caused, the more experienced men did not welcome the tanks. We were under trees, not the right place to be if the Germans threw in some shells. The fragments would ricochet around rather than whine off to become someone else's worry. Now, with these steel-sided tanks around, fragments could rattle around like ping-pong balls. Upon hearing this, I dug my slit trench a little deeper than usual. Having left their position as ordered, the tanks left an opening in our night guard perimeter, which had to be filled by the most available troops. For a while, the light weapons platoon of C Company became responsible for a certain segment of the American Army's most forward position in Italy. When kicked awake later that night, I stood shivering from the cool air as instructions were hoarsely whispered in my ear. Following in line, I was brought to the station for which I was responsible until daylight. My instructions were to keep my eyes and ears open and my mouth shut, and above all, not fall asleep. Falling asleep was probably the last thing I could do for the next 4 hours. Trying to keep the tremor from my voice, I asked just where I would expect the Germans to come from if indeed they came. Right from in front of you, pal. If you hear anything moving out there, it won't be me on an inspection tour. As I crept into a shallow foxhole and checked the safety on my carbine, I would not have bet 50 cents I would be there in the morning. I was scared, and the thought of getting out of there was powerful in my mind. As frightened as I was, the fellow in the next hole threw a pebble to get my attention. "How's you doing, fella?" "I'm okay," I answered, and suddenly I was, although my mouth felt like I had been sucking on a lead quarter. Dawn came up that morning like a hole in the elbow of your favorite sweater, slowly at first, then suddenly it was there. Chapter 12. We left that position a little later and continued moving forward against an enemy that did not want to fight. Outside of some harassing sniper fire and an artillery round reminding us that we were being observed, we moved in almost a straight line towards another village. By this time, I was something of a veteran. I had been in one or two shooting affairs, and in a week or so I had been in action. I had gained confidence in myself. Just when the battle for the town commenced, I could not tell you. Suddenly, a lot of shells came our way, and we were under machine gun and mortar fire. Our artillery did their best to weaken the enemy's strength. I'm sure a lot of the Germans were killed, but there seemed to be plenty left to take us on as we made our assault, running single file through a devastated orchard. Moved from tree to wall, wall to tree, flopping to the ground as the fire came close to us, and lugging those 2 ammo boxes and the accustomed lead weight in my stomach. Suddenly, 3 or 4 British planes came roaring in over our heads, firing their cannon at targets right in front of us. Their guns reminded me of the sound of a stick as you run it along a picket fence. I am sure it sounded a lot more ominous to the ones being shot at. I was told that this was the first time the company had received air support. I know it was the only time I saw it. A couple of squads of riflemen were in front of us. I could see them firing their guns at the enemy right in front of them. They would rise just above the stone wall they were hiding behind, trigger off 3 or 4 shots, and duck down as return fire slammed into the wall, then up again and shoot. I guess they had too steady a rhythm going. 2 of them got hit on the rise the next time they tried it. We all had to cross an open spot in the road to get under cover on the other side. The Germans had that spot all lined up. Yes, sirree, they did. Fortunately for us, when our turn came to cross, some of their firepower had been put out of commission. Yet just across the road were wounded German riflemen, and every so often, whether someone was dashing across or not, a spate of bullets would come whistling by. The whole thing was scary when I learned we had to do it. A lieutenant gave us our orders. Spread out. Do you want to draw more fire on yourselves? Do not bunch up. Keep 5 yards apart. Spread out. Spread out. To move further away from the man in front of me was the last thing I would have thought of. I can remember an almost irresistible urge to get close to somebody. I heard the lieutenant yell angrily, "You with the ammo boxes, back off from the man in front of you." It was a shock to realize he was yelling at me. Our corporal called to me, "Drop those ammo boxes and you'll sure as hell go back for them." Although heavy and bulky, I would not think of dropping them. I had hidden behind them before and intended to do it again, right in the middle of this road, if need be. Nobody talked to one another. You just went when your time came. It was not heroic. You went because the other guy went, and the one behind you went because you went. A feeling of grim anxiety gripped us all, mixed with a feeling of confused excitement. When it came to my turn, I ran across that road just as the others did, with bent knees, shoulders hunched, ape-like. A man we called Texas was the one I was to follow. I had started across when I saw Texas stop short and start looking around for something. A high-pitched lieutenant-type voice yelled, "Get across that damned road or I'll kick your behind all the way back to Texas. You with the ammo boxes, keep your distance." Keep my distance? To do that, I would have to stop in the middle of that death trap, so I took my chances with authority and kept going. As I flew past Tex, I grunted a question. "What's the matter?" "Cigarettes," he snapped back. My God, he is endangering his life for a pack of butts. He followed me across the road to where the other platoon members had assembled. The lieutenant, the sergeant, and the corporal all landed on Tex at the same time. I think if the Germans had not started shooting at us right then, they would have peeled the flesh right off his bones. They were outraged. The other section members better acquainted with Tex were very surprised he would stop for anything when under fire. It seemed that previously he had gained a reputation for not staying around when things got hot. He did it again that night when we were ordered to move our gun forward to give the rifle company a covering fire. Getting there, We came under a lot of rifle fire from the Germans hidden in the town. Tex and the tripod he was carrying did not go with us. Finding it difficult to believe one of us would leave the others in danger, I surmised he had been wounded or killed. There was plenty of opportunity for either. Buddy, the other ammo carrier, was sent back for another tripod, and we settled for whatever was to come. We did not fire a single round that night. As battles in the course of history are noted for their historical or political impact, I am sure the one taking place will be overlooked. It was justifiably another day and night battle for a little town on the Italian front, in a war theater no longer considered relevant. Dawn was still an hour away when the firing came to a halt. We left our position and returned to some buildings used as command posts by the company commander. Interestingly, we found 4 Germans captured during the fighting were being held there for questioning before being sent to the rear. 2 of the Germans were kids, younger than I was, I am sure. Another was an older man, maybe in his 40s. The 4th was as close to a typical German as imagined, taller than average with blonde hair and blue eyes. He looked arrogant, the others scared and tired. We looked him over. He looked us over. Crummy bastard. One reflex action of my trigger finger, and he would be a typical dead German. We gulped down a cold meal and settled for a quick nap when some firing broke out just a short distance away. Quickly forgetting about sleep, we went to see what was up. Some Germans were trapped in a farmhouse by Italian partisans. A private war had started up while we were relaxing from ours. The action took place in a small, steep-sided valley with a church at the end nearest us. About 100 yards to the left of it was a farmhouse with a thatched roof. Just beyond it was a stone-walled barn. The Germans in the farmhouse were having it out with the partisans in the barn and seemed oblivious to the rest of the war. Some of our guys decided on their own to get into the action. They started firing at the farmhouse, apparently having little effect, as the fire was not returned. In the meantime, artillery spotters from our side managed to get into the church steeple. They began calling coordinates to an artillery base. Due to a sudden lull in the action, we could hear them making their calls very clearly. Obviously, so could the Germans, as they began to fire at the steeple in hopes of silencing the spotters. They were unsuccessful, and a minute or two later, a rangefinder shell slammed into the valley's far side. A second hit right alongside the farmhouse, igniting the thatched roof. That was enough for the Germans. A white flag was shoved out of a window and the scene ended. Tex turned up explaining he had gotten lost in the confusion and excitement. I viewed his explanation with as much skepticism as the others. Little did I know I would soon be in the same fix. Chapter 9. Loaded on familiar trucks, we took off suddenly to what seemed a nearby battlefront. We traveled in fits and starts as the road wound around many small hamlets. Some were of a pretty good size and could be called towns if they could have afforded paving stones. But they could not, and it was just dust, dust, dust. We ate sea rations while on the truck, and the only time we stopped was when a shell crater in the road delayed us. I thought we were just around the corner from the shooting when the trucks pulled off the road and into a field full of vehicles and tents. The night was falling, and it was pitch black by the time we were offloaded and counted. Lined up, leaving our gear on the trucks, we shuffled off, not knowing what to expect next. We came to a station of officers and were told to empty our pockets and wallets of all identification. All this was dumped into a garbage can to burn the following day. From there we were led into a tent and surrounded by dentists. With little flashlights and big instruments, they peered into and probed our mouths, looking for a tooth that might cause a problem when we were in battle. I felt sorry for anyone with a bad tooth that night because he did not have it for long.